there isn't a total separation, in my view, between what you people are saying about reading and oral language. So, for instance, just to take one example, there's some studies, old studies by Dunn and Kendrick, and also by some other authors who I can't remember, who, looking at oral corpora, have shown that mothers who talk more about the feelings of others have children who show more prosociality. So I'm interested in the relationship between later on language, oral language, and the sorts of things that, for instance, Stephen was talking about, and also Maryellen, in terms of what literature, reading literacy does. So fiction is not a unique source of complex emotional expression. And that raises a more general point, which is it's great to compare the language in a corpus of child-directed speech to book reading, but one does have to be very careful about the genres one's dealing with. So the corpora on childists encompass a huge range of situations, which include book reading, actually. And I think it would be quite interesting to try and separate out. One of the things I'm interested in is the language that parents use in book reading. And I don't think, although I could be wrong, that we haven't heard much about that. So if you look at, say, Meredith Rowe's work, she shows that in terms of oral speech to children, early on, it looks like frequency of words is the really important thing that predicts language development. But a bit later, it's narrative complexity. It's kind of references to the outside world. It's bringing the outside world into the child's experience. So again, that might be something where you people who are working on language in books might be interested in trying to compare it to language to slightly older children and to the language that parents use in books, because a parent using a picture book with a 12-month-old, that language is going to be very different. It's likely to be indicative and words, whereas even the same picture book to a 3-year-old, there's going to be much more complex language. And I think that's a really interesting point to make. And I think Kate mentioned this, and in a way, it follows from what Maryellen was saying as well. There's an incredible affordance for intervention studies here. I mean, you're all saying that this or that is important. How about trying it out in a controlled experiment? I mean, I know we do eye tracking and we do priming and all these things, and we've done lots of that. But intervention studies where you give a child or children a particular focus on something you're interested in and see if it actually changes that child's ability to process emotion, language, or whatever, seems to me to be a good way to go. I would have one caveat, however. We've just done an intervention study on the understanding of if, because, before and after, and got no results whatsoever. So they don't always work, but then that's the nature of science. So intervention studies, I think, are very important. One final thing, that's it. One is, it's not just parents talking to children, it's also teachers. So if you remember, Huttenlocher showed that a year in school listening to your primary school teacher who uses more complex language will actually improve children's complex language skills. So we've got to be worrying about oral language as well as written language. I think that's really important. And it's also very important when we're thinking about other cultures that have a tradition of complex oral language in speeches or argumentation where literacy is less available. And then the other thing, which is something I'm interested in, is socialization into reading. The very early stages, which are earlier than I think most of you have been talking about. How does a child get to know how to read a book, one, and get to want to read a book, two? So I think studying how children are socialized into reading, we've been doing a study here. I mean, it's really basic things like, do they know they've got to turn the page over to get to the end? Do they know they shouldn't be trying to smell the flour or try and eat the bun or whatever? These are very, very young children. but also how do you keep a child enthusiastic about reading? My feeling is that at least in lots of educational settings, you turn the kids off rather than turn them on. And years ago, we did a little study between two classrooms, one which had a sort of staged reading program and another had a library. And it was really interesting that in the classrooms with a library, the kids would recommend books to each other. And they would sort of say, that one's great. And whereas in the stage, they would more likely to say things like, oh, I can't read that yet because I'm only on the yellow book. So, I mean, this is a very silly example and we didn't publish it, but I think the two questions of the socialization of children into book reading and how you keep their enthusiasm through the school years are two things that are critically important, which will then afford all these results that you people are getting. So thanks very much.
So I would just like to give the floor to Maryellen and Kate, if you wanted to kind of comment on what Elena was saying.
Thank you. I don't think I disagree with anything you said, Elena, except that perhaps I don't think we're focusing only on book reading here, but focusing on variability in the range of experience, which of which the book versus spoken is one big cut. And of course, younger child versus older child is another dimension, and younger book versus older book, and all of that. I think Jessica Montag is talking tomorrow about what parents talk about while the book is in front of them versus what they are actually reading. And I think that will be interesting to hear what her new work has to say. Absolutely, the intervention work is clear, and especially with, I've been thinking since I think about adults, the rates of low literacy in adults in English, and certainly in English language, and the importance of literacy to certain job success and all of that. I think there's a real need for those interventions.
Yeah, I mean, I also agree with all of the points in your discussion. I think, Elena, and just picking up on the one about what parents talk about or the caregivers talk about in the shared book reading experience, I think is really important, and it's reminded of work that came from the Manchester group, where if the language of the text is complex, then the parents do less extra text talk, and if there's not much language in the book, then there's more extra text talk. And sort of makes me wonder about, linking to your point about intervention, what should we be doing here? We know interventions that try and encourage parents to do more shared reading and more scaffolding and more extra text talk are not showing brilliant transfer effects. And maybe we need to get the language in the books as opposed to, you know, the extra text talk a little bit, and where the sweet spot is between those two things. Because maybe for parents who themselves don't have good language and literacy skills, having to do all that extra text talk is a challenge. Whereas if it's in the book, then maybe we can get some statistics out that way. Although, of course, that's completely different to the rich, interactive, embodied, shared communication that presumably is what's most critical.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think I'm looking forward to Jessica's talk tomorrow, because that's something we would have been wanting to look at as well, to look at what's actually going in extra text talk and how that relates to the linguistic content of the book and the pictures and so on. Mm-hmm. And your point on interventions, I agree completely. We've got a registered report paper that's been submitted that we're waiting for approval on to try and do exactly that, but in a very sort of focused and limited way, rather than a rollout type intervention, but more of an experiment intervention where we focus on manipulating the content of experience and then measure directly, you know, near transfer as opposed to far transfer type things.
Yeah, that's a crucial thing.
Yeah. No, but really, really interesting points. Thank you.